October 19th, 1944. The air was a suffocating blanket, woven from steam, gunpowder, and the primal heat of the Pacific sun. This was Lee Island in the Philippines, a green hell where every inch of jungle had to be paid for in blood and exhaustion. American artillery crews, ghosts draped in sweat and mud, fought the clock, wrestling crates of deadly cargo from the guts of Liberty's ships. The earth itself hammered under the unbearable concussion of every 155 millimeters shell fired, a screaming chorus designed to tear apart Japanese strongholds buried deep in the volcanic hills. Corporal John Evans, jaw set tight, paused in the endless chain of labor. He looked down. A cracked shell crate lay open, and spilled across the damp earth was a strange, almost reddish-brown dust. It wasn't marked, and it didn't look like the industrial powder he was used to handling. "What the hell is this stuff?" he muttered, before shrugging off the doubt. The war couldn't wait for curiosity. He loaded the round. A moment later, the jungle flashed blinding white. The shell landed with force that registered 3 miles distant, rattling the very roots of the ancient trees. But the journey of that explosive powder began not in a factory, not in a laboratory, but in a place far removed from the stench of battle. 3 years earlier, East Texas, summer 1941. The silence here was as oppressive as the noise in the Pacific. A sun-scorched cornfield outside Tyler County. Harold Gentry, howled to those who knew his quiet grit, was kneeling. At 42, his hands were tough, cracked maps of failure. The land was useless. A brutal drought had seized the soil, leaving it hard, brittle, and defeated. Hal held a plain mason jar filled with a strange, dull gray powder, a mixture of desperation and genius. Ammonium nitrate, a little ammonium sulfate, and ground charcoal. When he first started mixing it, his neighbors didn't just doubt him, they ridiculed him. "You're not a chemist, Hal." One man scoffed down at him at the grain elevator. "You're just going to blow up your whole damn field." Hal didn't argue. He just kept mixing, testing, watching. What neither Hal nor his laughing neighbors could ever have known was that this stupid fertilizer mix, born of the need to coax life from dead earth, possessed a secret efficiency. It was stable, easy to produce, and abundant. It was a perfect industrial workhorse. It crossed the ocean. It found its way into war factories, into artillery shells, into the very rounds now pulverizing enemy fortifications in the Pacific. Not yet as the primary explosive, but as a stable, necessary filler that maximized firepower. Within 12 months, the United States War Production Board quietly filed a top-secret memo under the name Project Green Grain. By 1944, thousands of tons of American munitions carried the trace elements of a formula that began in one man's 120-acre cornfield in East Texas. They called him just a farmer. They said his mix was foolish. They were profoundly wrong. This is a true story of how one overlooked man, armed only with stubborn resolve and no formal education, created an engine of firepower that echoed across jungles half a world away, something that helped win a war. And it all started with dirt. Harold Hal Gentry and the soil that defied Texas. Hal Gentry was born on August 15, 1908, in the quiet piney woods of Tyler County, Texas. His father, Ernest Gentry, was a second-generation corn farmer. His mother, Ruth, taught arithmetic in the one-room schoolhouse that served their part of East Texas. They weren't wealthy. They had only land. 120 acres of stubborn red clay soil that stretched out along the edge of the Nishes River. Hal grew up chasing. For most boys in East Texas, life was a simple arithmetic, sun, dirt, and sweat. It meant chasing chickens barefoot, mending fences, and listening to the old men at the general store debate crop yields and soil pH like it was Sunday scripture. But while most boys in the county dreamed of oil rigs or cattle empires, Hal had a stranger, almost monomaniacal fascination: the raw, dense chemistry of the dirt beneath his boots. At 12, he wasn't collecting marbles. He was gathering his mother's discarded coffee tins to test different combinations of ash, sand, and manure on wild onions behind the barn. She laughed, but she let him. That same year, he borrowed a faded copy of Elementary Agricultural Science in the school library and read it until the pages tore at the seams, devouring the text like forbidden gospel. By the spring of 1935, inheriting the farm during the tail end of the Great Depression, how it had already begun keeping thick, handwritten journals labeled nitrogen experiments and moisture control. He didn't call himself a scientist. He hadn't even finished high school, but he possessed a habit most men lacked. He recorded everything. Every rainfall, every planting, every subtle shift in leaf color. In East Texas, the soil was tough. The summers were arid, the winters fleeting, and the clay in the earth made planting feel like chiseling into stone. By 1941, as the war machine began to spin up in Europe and agricultural demand soared across the U.S., Hal was struggling. Texas corn was supposed to hit 35 bushels per acre. Hal was stuck at a miserable 28. That's when he made the mix. It began with ammonium nitrate, a common nitrogen-rich fertilizer. But Hal noted it leached too quickly in his fields. The vital nitrogen vanished before the crops could grasp it. He added ammonium sulfate, hoping the heavier sulfur compound might slow the release. It helped, but only slightly. Then came the charcoal. Ground down, pulverized to fine, black dust. It absorbed moisture and held the volatile compounds together in a way that surprised even Hal. The texture changed, becoming dense and stable. The soil stayed cooler, richer, greener. He called it Gentry Mix TX41, and the laughter started immediately. "This ain't no science lab, Hal," a neighbor sneered. "You're making barbecue rub for your plants." But something profound was happening. On a 3-acre test plot, Hal's corn came in taller, darker, and impossibly green. He recorded a yield of 40 bushels per acre, a jump of more than 40%. He tested it again and again, adjusting the ratios, and the numbers held firm. What Hal, the lone farmer obsessed with soil pH, could not possibly have known was that the chemical composition of a stable, dense fertilizer mix bore an uncanny resemblance to the early-stage compounds used in high-performance munitions. It was not explosive on its own, but it was stable, dense, and packed with extraordinary potential energy. In a world now rushing toward global war, where every scrap of captured nitrogen could mean the difference between a victory, the simple bag of nitrogen, purchased at the county co-op, was about to become a national secret. Hal Gentry's innocent quest to save his corn had stumbled onto the dark heart of wartime chemistry. The question wasn't if fertilizer could grow crops, but how easily it could turn into a weapon. Hal Gentry didn't know he was handling the bones of a bomb. For him, ammonium nitrate, the white crystalline salt, was salvation for the struggling East Texas dirt, a powerful jolt of nitrogen. He bought it by the sack, ignoring the faint metallic scent and never truly questioning the ominous warning sign taped to the separate storage shed. Neighbors used it sparingly, always buffered by lime or gypsum. But Gentry, desperate, pushed the boundary. He wasn't an anarchist. He was just a farmer fighting the drought, trying to keep his corn stalks breathing through the furnace of a Texas summer. The terrible irony? Ammonium nitrate wasn't just useful for crops. Given the right catalyst, this simple farm supply could destroy structures, shatter concrete, and tear armor plating like paper. It was fundamentally one of the most versatile and devastating dual-purpose compounds in the history of modern warfare. This is pure chemistry, formed from ammonia and nitric acid. The resulting salt holds a massive amount of excess oxygen, making it a perfect oxidizer. For the roots, it delivers life-giving nitrogen. But when encased in steel, that same oxygen feeds combustion. It transforms from food into fury. Mixed with common fuel source, diesel, sugar, or even simple charcoal, it detonates with violence that rivals military-grade TNT. This isn't theory. This is the simple, terrifying arithmetic of chemistry. By 1941, the world was drowning in war and starving for nitrates. Nitrogen was the lifeblood of the battlefield. Germany relied on the complex Haber-Bosch process to pull ammonia from thin air. Britain, strapped for resources, gambled on perilous Atlantic convoys carrying Chilean saltpeter. In the U.S., vast Midwestern chemical plants churn out tons of the compound for peacetime agriculture. But by late 1941, the War Department didn't ask. It commanded. Diversion orders stripped the chemical from the fields and rushed it toward the assembly lines. The scale was dizzying. A single 1,000-pound aerial bomb might require over 400 pounds of high-grade ammonium nitrate in its explosive charge. Multiply that by millions of shells, grenades, and bombs, and the demand quickly reached hundreds of thousands of tons. A chemical that had previously belonged only to feed stores and grain silos was now fueling Armageddon. It was during this desperate, global scramble for nitrogen that eyes turned, suddenly, back to a struggling corn patch in East Texas. Gentry's mixture, code-named TX-41, wasn't volatile. Not yet, but it possessed the two virtues the military obsessionally craved, stability and availability. Because Gentry used ground charcoal instead of volatile liquid fuels, the compound could be stored dry, packed tightly, and shipped across U-boat-infested oceans without risk of leaking or degrading. Crucially, it was dirt cheap. Every component was sourced domestically, requiring no dangerous imports or complex refining. This made it the perfect candidate for a new role, the booster compound. The booster is the necessary bridge, the critical link that takes the fragile, weak spark of the detonator and amplifies it into the seismic fury of the massive. The challenge was simple. The war machine needed a nuanced punch, a detonator charge powerful enough to initiate a primary blast, yet stable enough to survive the rough handling of field conditions. It had to be hotter than a standard fuse, but far safer than raw TNT. Gentry's experimental formula, with minor modifications, was the perfect answer. It checked every box. But as the military quietly logged Gentry mixed TX-41 onto its growing list of critical, experimental booster compounds, Hal knew nothing. He remained in East Texas, measuring rainfall, tracking soil acidity, completely unaware that the future of Allied ordnance was literally growing unseen in his muddy cornrows. By early 1942, the scramble was desperate. The War Production Board was furiously searching for new sources, drafting proposals to weaponize common agricultural compounds. One label kept resurfacing, scrawled in urgent pencil on a confidential report file from the depths of East Texas. Green grain, agricultural variant. Then came the unavoidable summons. The letter that shattered Gentry's quiet life arrived in a plain, sinister brown envelope. No return address. Just a single, stark line above held Gentry's name. Official business. War Production Board. The postmark confirmed the urgency. March 5, 1942. Hal tore open the envelope with the thick, calloused hands used for lifting 1,000-pound sacks of feed. Inside lay a single page, a glacial, stiff demand typed in relentless bureaucratic language. The government wanted a meeting. Specifically, the War Production Board and the shadowy Office of Scientific Research and Development were requesting an immediate technical consultation regarding recent formulations of nitrogen-based agricultural material. Gentry stared at the page, baffled, before resting it beside a piece of uneaten cornbread on his kitchen table. Why him? Why is dirt? But his eyes were drawn back to the final paragraph, underlined in heavy, commanding ink. Asterisk. Your compound has properties of critical interest to national defense research. Asterisk. 2 weeks later, the isolated farmer stepped onto a train in Lufkin, Texas. In one hand, he clutched a worn suitcase. In the other, his meticulously kept notebook of fertilizer metrics. He was wearing his best, an old wool coat and a hat that predated the Depression. He had never left the state. By the time he arrived in Washington, D.C., the cherry blossoms were blooming, masking the capital's fever-pitch tension. Japan had seized the Philippines. U-boats prowled the Atlantic periphery. The country was in a desperate race, not just to supply its own surging armies, but the entire, reeling Allied war machine. Gentry was ushered through a side entrance of a stark, nondescript government building off Pennsylvania Avenue. There was no fanfare, no escort, just a clipped handshake from a man in a featureless gray suit who identified himself simply as Mr. Hartley. They led him into a chilling, windowless conference room. 2 men were already waiting, one in a pristine white lab coat, the other adorned with a heavy gold of high military brass. A pitcher of ice water sat untouched, radiating cold silence at the center of the table. Hal set down his notebook and waited. What followed was not a consultation. It was an exacting interrogation. They demanded to know everything about his mix, The exact preparation, the specific temperatures, the chemistry, and precise agrarian logic behind every single ingredient. Hal Gentry, nervous but steady, laid out his findings. He spoke of rich black Texas soil, of nitrates leaching quickly in the spring rain, of fine charcoal dust balancing the moisture. He detailed how his corn yield soared by 40%. He spoke of agriculture. But the men in uniform saw only chemistry. They saw an engine of destruction. Gentry never uttered the word explosion. The military men did. Colonel Julius Black, his face etched with grim calculation, leaned across the oak table. "Mr. Gentry," he said, the silence in the room heavy, "are you aware that your fertilizer, with negligible modification, meets the critical density and energy thresholds for military ordnance?" Gentry simply stared. "Sir, I just wanted my corn to grow." Black allowed himself a thin, dangerous smile, though his eyes remained cold. "Mr. Gentry, you didn't grow corn. You just invented a booster charge superior to anything we currently field." Details were sparse. Security was paramount. Gentry signed papers promising compensation, a meager sum for an earth-shattering discovery and permanent consultation. Officially, he would return to his dusty Texas farm, a civilian ghost maintaining operational secrecy. Before he left, a man named Hartley delivered a chilling summation. "What you made isn't a bomb, Gentry, but it's the heart of the delivery system. And with the war the way it is, that may be just what we need." Gentry returned to Texas, weighted not by pride, but by confusion, and the awful certainty that the soil beneath his boots was no longer entirely his own. The innocent fertilizer experiment was now locked down, rebranded Project Green Grain. By the summer of 1942, the war arrived in the heart of Texas, not with the sound of incoming artillery, but with the roar of bulldozers and the incessant grind of rail cars. Near the quiet East Texas town of Karnak, pristine pine forests were decimated. In their place, a vital, secretive industrial behemoth rose, the Longhorn Army Ammunition Plant, covering over 8,500 acres, 13 square miles of ordnance warehouses, loading docks, and endless production lines. Its sole purpose was the mass production of trinitrotoluene, TNT. But the war machine was ravenous. It demanded more than just a primary explosive. It required components, fillers, stabilizers, and, critically, boosters. Materials that could stretch the limited supply of TNT further without sacrificing a fraction of lethal firepower. This necessity forged a path for Hal Gentry's unwanted legacy. Deep inside the administrative complex, anonymous hands typed a request. Green Grain Booster Variant TXF-41. It was a compound engineered to sit between the main TNT payload and the detonator, the crucial intermediary charge. The adaptation from the original agricultural mix was minor. The charcoal ground to a micronized dust, paraffin wax introduced to conquer moisture. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the results silenced every skeptic. Loaded into a 105mm shell casing, the modified mixture performed flawlessly. It burned cleanly, compressed perfectly, and delivered a shocking, sudden kick of energy. It was not as powerful as pure TNT, but it did not need to be. It was a crucial amplifier, a chemical scalpel designed to transfer kinetic energy with devastating, near-perfect consistency. Back in Karnak, the Longhorn plant was a fortress of scientific rigor, and initial resistance to the formula was fierce. "We are trusting a farmer's dirt recipe inside live artillery," scoffed one skeptical supervisor. But war respects no pedigree. The invasion of North Africa had drained munition stocks dry, and the expanding Pacific theater was swallowing strategic resources whole. Crucially, the vital raw material, twine, needed for conventional TNT, was running dangerously low. House formula, previously a novelty, had become a strategic necessity, a critical lifeline built from common materials. By October 1943, Project Green Grain was fully integrated. The explosive mix, sealed in drums labeled only Booster Variant C, bypassed standard manifest logs, known only by the cryptic formula code TXF-41. Thousands of 105mm and 155mm shells were now secretly carrying the power of the prairie. Hal Gentry remained unaware of the industrial scale of his contribution. He still rose before the sun, tending his rows of corn, meticulously logging rainfall in a spiral-bound notebook. Every 2 weeks, he received a crisp, plain envelope containing a check and a single, curt update. Asterisk, field results acceptable. Continue support. Asterisk, he asked for nothing more. To him, the measure of success was knowing that something built with patience, dirt, and relentless trial and error might help bring the war to an end. Deep inside the Longhorn facility, the elite engineers had given a legend, a nickname whispered only behind locked gates: the farmer's fire. Yet, no wartime experiment survived without risk. And in early 1944, Gentry's pivotal mix faced collapse, not by enemy ordnance, but by an insidious domestic threat. The alarm sounded on a bleak, rainy February morning. A routine quality inspection flagged multiple barrels of TXF-41. A microscopic flaw in the storage chain had allowed moisture to creep in, softening the volatile compound into useless, compromised clumps. The reading was catastrophic: 5.2% moisture by weight. The unforgiving military safety threshold was 3. Initially, the inspection team suspected simple negligence, a poorly sealed drum. But a second batch failed the same brutal test. Then a third. Within 72 hours, the entire booster line, involving green grain, ground to a grinding halt. Production delays spiraled. A major warfront offensive was approaching. Tension became palpable fear. Hal Gentry was summoned from his farm. He arrived at the imposing gates of Longhorn wearing the same worn field jacket and hat, still carrying the faint, earthy scent of diesel and soil. He was waved past the security checkpoints without delay or ceremony. Inside, men in immaculate white coats, clipboards clutched tightly, strode frantically between sterile labs and testing bays. Hal, the farmer transported to this cathedral of science, felt utterly alien. They brought him to a long, cold metal table. The vast storage warehouse held a secret volatility. 2 drums of the wet chemical mix had been opened, and the air was thick with the acidic, metallic tang of propellant. A chemist, his gloved fingers stained yellow, held up a sample of the grain booster and let it crumble like dry earth. "It's unstable," he reported, his voice devoid of inflection but heavy with implication. "If this material had been shipped overseas, we'd be facing catastrophic misfires. Or worse, premature detonation." How? The engineer responsible for formula pushed past the lab technicians, demanding access to the warehouse logs. For 30 agonizing minutes, he pored over production notes, tracking temperatures and humidity readings, spotting the deadly pattern the laboratory team had missed. Every single failed batch had been routed through the new wing of the warehouse, the only section lacking active dehumidification systems. Hal slammed his finger down on the manifest, marking the fatal error. The room fell into a heavy, incriminating silence. The lead supervisor ran a frantic, trembling hand through his hair. "Are you telling me this wasn't a formula problem?" Hal met his desperate gaze. "Not if the mix was dry going in. You can't blame the dough if the oven's leaking." The fix was immediate. All drums were relocated, and the climate controls were drastically upgraded. But the incident left a deep, corrosive scar. Senior officials at the War Production Board now viewed the revolutionary green grain booster with profound suspicion. Suggestions began circulating about abandoning the high-efficiency compound entirely and reverting to older, less powerful powders. Then came the disaster that extinguished all remaining goodwill. In March, at Loading Station 4, a violent, deafening thump echoed across the plant floor. Not a full-scale explosion, but a concussive deflagration during the complex shell packing process. 3 workers were caught in the blast and grievously injured. The preliminary AAR cited static discharge from a metal tool. But when word leaked that the shell had been packed with the controversial TXF-41, Hal's new mix, whispers of negligence turned into screeching national headlines. Hal was officially cleared of direct implication, yet he felt the responsibility like a physical burden. That night, he sat alone on his porch, a ledger forgotten in his lap, a cigarette burning down between his fingers, a habit he rarely indulged in, but this night demanded it. He did not sleep. At dawn, he drafted a single handwritten letter to the plant manager. "If you think the mix isn't safe," the note pleaded, "stop using it. I didn't make this compound to hurt anyone. The reply arrived 3 days later, typed in cold, formal script. Asterisk, we are resuming green grain use. The issue was procedural, not chemical. Your mix remains valuable. So due, asterisk. It was not praise, but it was acceptance. Hal returned to his life. The doubts never vanished, but among the rise of the corn and the low hum of the wind, he reminded himself that risk was part of war, and risk was part of discovery. If his volatile, high-efficiency compound had a part to play in winning the conflict, he would see it through, even if no one ever spoke his name. This dangerous new ordnance was shipping overseas, destined for the farthest reaches of the Pacific. October 20th, 1944. The American invasion fleet arrived off Leyte Island. At dawn, the first American boots hit the shores. The rising sun was just beginning to burn off the morning mist, but the jungle was already screaming, alive with continuous gunfire, the heavy roar of mortars and the shrill, merciless whine of Japanese machine guns hidden in the hills. This was the beginning of General Douglas MacArthur's long-promised return, the liberation of the Philippines. And the Japanese had made it brutally clear they had no intention of yielding the island without demanding a terrible price. They called the beaches meat grinders. Every dune concealed a nest of fire. Every rise had a fortified bunker, reinforced with steel and concrete, turning the approach into a meticulously planned gauntlet of death. Allied soldiers were pinned down, huddled behind the inadequate shelter of shattered palm trunks and sand berms, watching their tenuous beachhead dissolve into a bloody stalemate. Progress evaporated. Casualties mounted. Then a low, subterranean tremor began, quickly accelerating into a deafening roar. Miles offshore, a colossal force was preparing to speak. The heavy guns of the American fleet, cruisers and battleships parked just over the horizon, unleashed a sustained, terrifying orchestra of destruction. This was not mere shelling. It was one of the largest naval bombardments ever conceived in the Pacific theater. Massive 155mm shells cut screaming parabolas through the air, each one a messenger of steel and fire. Some carried pencil-scrawled messages, the names of sweethearts or desperate prayers. But others carried a silent, powerful secret. A tiny booster compound, labeled TXF-41, nestled deep within the warhead. This was Hal Gentry's creation, a volatile green powder born the relentless heat and dirt of East Texas. The men on the beach didn't know the chemical formula, nor did the crews firing the ordnance. They only knew the sound had changed. Marine Sergeant Victor Duca, pressed flat behind a splintered tree stump, later captured the horror in his field diary. It sounded like the sky had been peeled open. The ground lifted under us like a mattress. It didn't just explode. It pushed. You could feel it in your chest. The Japanese fire, which had been constant, stuttered. Then, after 40 minutes of sustained, overwhelming fire, the defensive line along Red Beach simply disintegrated. Forward observers watched in stunned silence. Bunkers designed to weather weeks of conventional artillery were not merely breached. They were annihilated, shattered beyond recognition. In places, the sheer, unnatural force had scalped the hillside, tearing up deep roots, ancient rock, and steel rebar, throwing them high into the trees. This wasn't suppression fire. This was geological erasure. A munitions officer aboard the USS Tennessee, drafting a memo just 2 days after the initial assault, noted the terrifying efficiency. Shell performance exceeded prior expectations in consistency and detonation spread. Suspect cause is related to new booster compound issued in TX Lot 6. Further testing recommended. That TX Lot 6 was a secret. The enhanced green grain shipped from the Longhorn Army ammunition plant in Karnak, Texas, weeks earlier. By the time the campaign reached its bloody peak, over 250,000 shells containing the TXF-41 booster had scoured the island, utilizing an estimated 4 million pounds of the volatile material. The Japanese command noticed. Captured field manuals revealed a chilling shift in doctrine. They began abandoning earthworks, turning to deep concrete reinforcement, burying their weapon systems far deeper underground. They had learned, through catastrophic loss, that the Americans had fundamentally altered the destructive power of their artillery. They never knew what had changed. Back in Texas, Thousands of miles from the carnage of creation wrought, Hal Gentry sat alone in his kitchen, listening to the static-laced radio broadcast. He was oblivious to the fact that his dusty, forgotten compound had just pulverized a crucial enemy defense line halfway across the world. He felt it in his gut, a heavy metallic coil tightening beneath the Texas sun. He was pouring his morning coffee, watching the pale green shoots break the stubborn clay, when the news hit the radio waves, distant yet echoing. He didn't know his experimental formula. The mix designed to push corn yields higher was now being used to crack concrete and tear down volcanic mountainsides. No one had told him. Hal Gentry, the quiet chemist of Tyler County, wasn't on a landing craft in the Pacific. He wasn't wearing a uniform. Yet, as he glanced out over his neat, furrowed fields, he understood the awful, unseen power he had manufactured. It was not pride. It was certainly not fear. It was a profound, isolating recognition that the very earth he tended was now fueling the engine of destruction. He was a hero without a ribbon, a destroyer operating 10,000 miles from the front lines. By the time American forces secured the final, bloody objectives, the headlines back home were roaring with victory. Newspapers ran photographs of brave soldiers, of triumphant flags raised over smoking hills, of generals confidently striding ashore. But there were no pictures of Hal Gentry. There were no mentions of the green grain, explosive booster, no interviews, no medals, no parades. Back in Tyler County, Texas, the man whose fertilizer experiment had helped crack some of the Pacific's toughest fortifications was harvesting corn alone, quiet, and profoundly unaware of just how far his agricultural chemistry had traveled. Hal received only one telegram that month. It was brief, from the War Department. It read with stark, bureaucratic indifference. TXF-41 contributions to booster class ordnance acknowledged. Continue regular shipments. Performance exceeds projected. That was it. No signatures, no insignia, just numbers and cold utility. He folded the paper, crisp and thin, and placed it carefully in his ledger. He never mentioned it to anyone. In town, people still tease him about the distinctive, earthy odor of his fertilizer mix. They called it Gentry's goat dust because of the way it clung stubbornly to your boots. Hal just smiled, nodded, and went back to work. Even the feed store clerk, who years earlier had openly mocked Hal's obsession with soil chemistry, now bought seed from Hal's harvest without knowing that the same elemental forces had been absorbed straight into the Allied arsenal. Sometimes I would drive past the post office and catch a glimpse of a service flag hanging silently in a neighbor's window. Gold stars were fallen, blue stars for those still serving. And Hal would wonder, had one of those boys been saved by the sudden, terrible force of his mix? He never asked. He never spoke. He had no uniform, no rank, no ribbon to prove his involvement. But he had the isolating burden of knowing something few civilians ever do, that the line between life and death, between agonizing failure and brutal victory, can sometimes run straight through a patch of stubborn Texas earth. There was one evening, just one, when the silence nearly broke. It was the spring of 1945. The war was grinding toward its catastrophic conclusion. The sun set in thick, desperate orange streaks over the horizon, and Hal was sitting on his porch with his niece, Claire, a school teacher visiting from Dallas. She had brought a newspaper, the front page dominated by the horrifying, iconic photograph from Iwo Jima. The flag, the bodies, the terrible, relentless price of progress. Claire looked at her uncle, her voice barely a whisper against the rising chorus of cicadas. "Do you ever wish you'd done more, Hal?" He didn't answer at first. He just stared out at the rows of corn beginning to sprout, pale green spears rising against the deep red clay. Finally, he said, the war was a symphony of violence, defined by noise, the scream of the Stukas, the thunder of Allied guns, the metallic screech of a Panther track failing under fire. Yet, the fate of the entire front often turned on things the fighting men never heard. A formula, a decision, a solitary, quiet act of genius born thousands of miles from front lines. Years later, when the relentless fury of Operation Luttich had faded into memory, and the files detailing Project Green were quietly declassified, the true identity of the man behind the revolutionary ordnance booster TXF-41 was finally revealed. Hal Gentry. He never bragged, never claimed credit. He stayed on his farm in Ohio, a ghost in the official annals of combat. He worked his fields through the drought of 1949 and the mechanization wave of the 50s. He died in his sleep in 1971 at the age of 63. His local obituary listed him as a farmer, a man of quiet faith. It didn't mention the shells, the high-velocity charges, or the war he helped win. But in a filing cabinet in Washington, D.C., inside a folder once marked Confidential Ordnance Materials, Booster Class C, the name Gentry was still there, a farmer, a nobody, a hero without a uniform. His fertilizer mix, born from quiet persistence, ridicule, and an honest desire to grow something good, became the unseen force behind 1,000 explosions. It was that silent innovation that allowed Lieutenant Carl Hartman, commanding his Sherman tank during the decisive counterattack at Mortain, to survive. It gave Gunner Earl Bishop the penetrating velocity needed to shatter the thick glassy plate of a German tank at impossible range. It granted Loader James Ortega those crucial fractions of a second to slam the next round home before the crew, including the steadfast driver Tony Vitelli, were annihilated. Every time a round found its target, every time a crew lived through a German push toward a ranch, they owed their lives to the man in the heartland. Hal Gentry didn't ask for anything. He didn't demand a statute or a chapter in a history book. He didn't even tell his neighbors what he'd done. He just went back to the land, back to the soil, the weight of consequence carried without applause. And maybe that is the part that stays with you. Because for all the noise of war, the shouts of command, the roar of factories, some of the most decisive moments in history begin in silence, in stillness, in a man standing alone in a field holding a jar of dust, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he's found something no one else sees. History isn't shaped only by the words of generals or the threat of a court-martial. It's shaped by those who work unseen, who invent, who persist. When Lieutenant Hartman filed his official AR detailing the destruction of the German thrust, he credited teamwork, training, and luck. He never knew the name Hal Gentry, nor the silent contract the inventor had made with history. The real legacy of Hal Gentry isn't just in the blueprints or the shells fired. It's what he reminds us about ourselves, that even in an age of machines and metrics, it is still the human heart that invents, still the citizen who, without rank or ribbon, shapes the tide. What would you have done in his place? If your quiet, strange personal work suddenly held the power to change the course of history, would you give it away, knowing it might save thousands of lives? Would you carry that immense, silent risk?